Hello and welcome to the week 3 lecture on Hellenistic and Roman medicine and natural philosophy. I just want to show you here then the outline for today. We're going to start by talking about the Hellenistic world and what that is, and then also the development of the Roman Empire and its relationship to the Hellenistic world. Then turn to the development of Hellenistic medicine and look actually go back to the classical period and look at Hippocrates and Hippocratic medicine, then turn to Alexandrian medicine under the Alexandrian medicine during the Hellenistic period, and then turn to Galen and his system of medical humorism that develops during the Roman period. And then the IDs are Hellenistic empires, Alexandria, Hippocrates, Galen, and medical humorism. And I should just say right now that I'm not going to talk about the Hellenistic alchemy that you have read about for the readings this week too. I'm going to save that for when we go a little bit further into the class. I wanted you to read it now to go along with the Hellenistic period, but we will pick that up in subsequent weeks, and I won't be talking about that in the lecture today.
So I want to just start with a few introductory remarks about what we're covering this week and how it fits in with what we covered last week thematically and chronologically. So last week we covered natural philosophy in the sort of among the pre-Socratics that went from basically the 7th to the 5th century, or translating that, the 600s and the 500s is roughly when they lived. And then we turn to the kind of post-Socratic natural philosophers in the classical period, which is really sort of the 5th and the 4th centuries. So the 400s and the 300s BCE. Now we are turning to the sort of the next period, or the next era following the classical era, which is the Hellenistic age, then followed by sort of the Roman period, or the height of the Roman Empire. And so the period that we're looking at today, that we're kind of focusing on, is the period from around 300 BCE to 300 CE. So basically a 600-year period that covers what's known as the Hellenistic era, which is sort of the spreading of Greek influence throughout the Mediterranean, and then as far east as India, and then followed by the Roman period, which is when the Roman Republic, and then it transforms into an empire, is sort of rising and expanding, and then expands all around the Mediterranean. So that's what we're looking at today, and we're going to be continuing the sort of interest in natural philosophy. But during this period, we actually are going to be looking at natural philosophy through medicine. So we're really going to be looking at the history of medicine in the Hellenistic and the Roman periods. And that's for a couple of different reasons that, again, we'll be talking about this all in more detail in the lecture, but I wanted to sort of set this out in broad outlines right now. So we're going to be studying medicine for, like I said, a couple of reasons. One is that actually during this Hellenistic period, especially from the 200s into the 100s, or from the 3rd century into the 2nd century BCE, there were natural philosophers, but we don't really have any of their writings. The only writings that we have, or how can I say this, the only way we know of these natural philosophers is because of what later people said about them. So their writings are not what we call extant, in the sense that they don't exist anymore. We don't have any fragments, we don't have any record of their actual writings. So it's actually a period in which there's relatively thin documentation, and like I said, we only know about them from writers after the fact, and it tends to be medical writers who talked about these natural philosophers, and these natural philosophers sometimes were physicians as well. So there's a source kind of bias toward medicine, And then secondly, in in the Roman Empire, and I'll talk about this more in a later in the lecture, but in the Roman Empire, natural philosophy was not how can I say this? That the Romans were very interested in natural philosophy, but it was the natural philosophy of the classical Greeks, and they read it and they were interested in it, but they didn't really write a lot of new philosophy of their own. They tended to be more concerned with practical issues. Romans were, for instance, great engineers, so they applied a lot of the more utilitarian and practical aspects of natural philosophy, and were able to accomplish a lot that way. But in terms of philosophy itself, they didn't do a lot to kind of extend it. Or to develop sort of new and original ideas of their own. I mean, not that Romans weren't smart and weren't original in and of themselves. They certainly were, but the emphasis tends to be less on philosophy in and of itself than more of kind of applying the ideas of philosophy to practical matters. And for that reason, that's another reason why you tend to see natural philosophy more in medicine. And so it's much more fruitful for this period, for the Hellenistic and the Roman periods, to be studying medicine. And then that's where we're going to see natural philosophy. And that's where you do see some originality in terms of how natural philosophy is being applied and extended, but again, through medicine. So that's why our focus here is on medicine. That the kind of the another way to say this, I guess, is that the great scholars of this period, of the Hellenistic and the Roman period, tended to be physicians, at least as far as natural philosophy is concerned. In terms of politics and ethical writings and things like that, rhetoric, Rome certainly had a number of really great, great scholars, great thinkers. But as far as natural philosophy and the ideas of cosmology, cause and effect, and explaining natural phenomena, you tend to see that more actually in terms of medicine. And some of the great thinkers we're going to be looking at today are, as you can see from the outline, we're going to be looking at Hippocrates and Galen, and then other sort of Hellenistic physicians. So that's just some kind of introductory description of where we are and what we're studying, what we're going to be focusing on this week. So I just want to start by, again, another kind of broad overview here is to look at, again, where we are in the map in terms of where we are in world history. So let me just get my pen here. And so again, we're looking at sort of Greece as sort of the epicenter here. And then the Italian peninsula, I'll show these up much more up close in a minute, but I just want to show you again where we are in the world, then the Mediterranean world here, and then the Hellenistic world actually extends all the way out to the Indus Valley, sort of just the edges of kind of northern India and what's today Pakistan. So that's kind of the region that we're looking at today. So let me show you, again, more of a close-up here. Here's the Mediterranean world. So we're going to be, continuing to look at Greece and also Anatolia, or I should say also this area of modern Turkey. It's also referred to as Asia Minor here. This is where the Ionian coast was. And then, what was the other? Oh, and then the Italian peninsula right here, which is basically modern day Italy. That's sort of the seat of the center of the Roman Empire. So we're going to look at these areas. And then also here in Egypt, a really important city of Alexandria is established. And that's where a lot of the medical thinkers went, and they established a school there too. So those are some of the areas we're going to be focusing in on today in the lecture. So to begin, we're going to talk about the Hellenistic world and what that was. So where we left off in the lecture for last week is we had talked about the four schools of Rome, the four schools of Athens, sorry, and then the application of Aristotle's ideas to cosmology. And so we're going to pick up there and talk about then the continuing history of Greece and how that turns into kind of this larger Hellenistic world. So sort of coming to the end of the classical period in the 300s in Greece, you had just to the north of Greece, there was a kingdom called Macedon or Macedonia, and it's this basically this orange kind of period, right? This orange area right here, and so Macedonia was, like I said, this a monarchy that was just to the north of the kind of the center of the Greek world and the city states of the Greek world, and in the sort of by the mid 300s, it was led by a king named King Philip of Macedonia. And Philip went about making a number of reforms, especially to the Macedonian army, which I won't go into detail, but because of these reforms and the expansion of the Macedonian army, he's able to start to expand the territory of Macedonia. And so by the end of his reign, you can see in the map to the right, this whole kind of orange, darker and lighter orange area was under the control of Philip of Macedonia.
And here is a slide of him showing kind of what he looked like just to the right. The slide on the right is actually a bust of him that was found in his burial tomb. So that's presumably what he looked like later in life. And then on the left is a coin then with his image on it. So anyway, he reigned from 359 to 336 BC. And like I said, by the end of his reign, he had expanded Macedonia quite substantially. He was actually assassinated in 336, and then his kingdom was taken over by his son Alexander, who later came to be known as Alexander the Great, who then reigned, or I should say, he lived from 365 to 323 BCE, took over again in 336 BCE from his father at the age of 20. And Alexander decided that he wanted to keep expanding the kingdom of Macedonia as far as he could and sort of build on his father's ambitions of expansion. And he was able to take advantage of a major civil war that was going on between the Greek city-states, kind of between there were forces led by Athens that were sort of fighting against forces led by Sparta. And because of that, the Greek city-states were greatly weakened and unable to really mount any kind of real defense against the Macedonian invasion, Alexander's invasion. So he's able to then invade and take over Greece. Then he moves further east. So let me just stop here and just show you. So this is a picture of Philip and his son Alexander from a movie that was made not too long ago where Brad Pitt is Alexander the Great. So you can see here Brad Pitt is Alexander the Great. So anyway, back to what I was talking about. So Alexander conquers Greece, then he decides to move east, and so he moves east into Asia Minor, what's present day Turkey or Anatolia. Then he goes down south and is into sort of northeast Africa, conquers Egypt. Then he embarks on a campaign to conquer the Persian Empire, which is sort of this green area here, which covers Anatolia, but also much or most of what we consider today to be the Middle East. And that takes him really to the doorstep of India. I mean, he goes as far east as India on this, major kind of spectacular campaign. I mean, he's able to conquer wide territories relatively quickly. He was aided by the fact that much of this area was under the control of the Persian Empire. So there was sort of a centralized power. So he's able to take over that centralized power and then extend his own power over, basically what had been the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire had been a long time enemy of Greece, actually. So he defeats them. He moves, he's heading toward India. He's basically, at India's doorstep, and then his troops who hadn't, and he wanted to keep going, but his troops who had not planned on conquering this far east, they're homesick, they want to go home, they didn't plan on this. So they don't really revolt, but they convince him to turn around, to turn his armies around. And so he does that, and he starts to head back home. And along the way, I should say, he named a number of cities after himself. There were as many as 20 cities that were named Alexandria in his honor. So obviously, not a modest guy. And basically, on his way home, he actually the story is that he attended a banquet, this sort of a huge banquet, and he ate and drank a lot, and then developed this illness, and then died, a few days later. And so it's said that maybe he kind of, stuffed himself or drank too much. Maybe it was alcohol poisoning. There's all sorts of theories about this, but at any rate, he ends up dying like his father, kind of an untimely, premature death, when he was still a relatively young man. Uh, but so let me stop there for a second and just show you a couple more slides of the extent of Alexander's empire. So this is the empire that this is the area that he'd conquered, and it's basically considered to be under his rule now. This is Alexander's empire. This is around 323 BCE. So on the left, you can see it a little bit more up close. And then on the right, I just wanted to, again, you to see what a huge area he has conquered here when you look at it in terms of sort of Afro-Eurasia altogether there. So this is a very widespread area. And remember that Greece was also really hooked into the whole Mediterranean world. So arguably, you could say that, let me get my pen again, that really the influence then even extends further out around to surround the Mediterranean as well, even though he hadn't sort of, actually conquered those areas. But we'll see that gets incorporated into the Roman Empire. So it actually does end up officially getting kind of incorporated into this. But that's for a few minutes from now. So why am I going into all this background on Philip of Macedonia and Alexander the Great? Because once Alexander dies, he actually well, he doesn't, but then the empire, he dies this premature, untimely, kind of surprise death. And so what happens is that his generals end up dividing this huge area into three different empires, each controlled by one of his major generals. So you end up with the Antigonid Empire, which is the green area, which is basically Macedonia and Greece. Sort of this area, I guess you can tell the green. Then there's the Ptolemaic Empire, again named after one of his generals named Ptolemy, not to be confused with the Ptolemy that is talked about in the Copernican Revolution, who was a geographer in the Roman period, who we're going to talk about a lot down the road in this class. So it's a different Ptolemy that can sometimes be confusing, but Ptolemy was one of Alexander's then generals. So that orangey pink area, basically Egypt, and part of Palestine was under the control of Ptolemy, the Ptolemaic Empire. And then this whole purple area that had basically been the Persian Empire becomes the Seleucid Empire, named after a general Seleucus. So these become what are known as the Hellenistic empires, and again cover this very, very wide swath of territory. And they're important to our story because they end up, these conquests and these empires that are established end up spreading Greek influence throughout this entire area. So not just around the Mediterranean anymore, but now extending as far east as India. And it's a Greek influence that actually interacts with local kind of, you could call them foreign influences, so that it's a blended kind of culture, or what we could call a syncretic Greek culture that develops in these different areas. But there's an underlying unity of this Greek influence, and it's called Hellenistic to indicate that it's not just purely Greek. So Greek would be Hellenic, but it's called kind of Greek-ish, Hellenistic, so that it has Greek influence that again blends with kind of local cultures. But what you see is the spreading out through this whole area of Greek architectural elements. You see Greek architecture. You see Greek kind of clothing and the sort of draped kind of toga designs. You see that in statuary throughout this entire region. You see Greek influences on even Buddhist art. In especially in the more eastern regions of this area. And in addition to that, you also see Greek ideas about medicine and natural philosophy spreading throughout this area too. So that's where you see our picture coming into this. And so this is what we call then the Hellenistic empires. Then, and I'll show you a few more slides so that you can see. Again, here are the different empires. So these are the Hellenistic empires in which, again, Greek art and architectural styles and Greek learning, and I should say also Greek writing and language spreads throughout this too, so that educated people often tended to learn and know Greek, and that the educated world, the educated elite in these areas also would have known Greek and would have read the Greek uh, classical works. They would have known of them. Uh, and one last point I just want to make is that there were some really important centers of culture and learning that were established in the Hellenistic empires, the most important of which, I should say, Athens continued to be an important center of learning, but there's a city of Alexandria established in in Egypt, right on the Mediterranean coast. Here's Alexandria, in the Ptolemaic Empire. That really in some ways overtakes Athens as the center of especially medical learning. And there's a really important medical school that's established in Alexandria. And there's also a major lighthouse. So Alexandria is actually has a lot of kind of importance. It's almost legendary kind of within the Hellenistic empires. And it's said that there was a lighthouse. You can actually see it here in this. This is not an actual, how can I say this? This is a conceptual kind of drawing of what Alexandria probably looked like in the ancient period, or sort of in the, I should say, in the Hellenistic period, kind of in the the 300s into the 200s into the 100s BCE. But anyway, it said that it had this huge lighthouse that shone this enormous light out into the Mediterranean so that ships could be guided safely into the harbor. Here's some more images of what the lighthouse may have looked like based on ancient descriptions. And it also had a museum, again, another sort of legendary part of Alexandrian history. It said that it had this sort of huge museum, which was the center of learning, with this enormous library that had thousands and thousands of treatises written on papyrus that were in scrolls that were rolled up, which you can see here. These sort of all these shelves and shelves and shelves holding all these scrolls of learned writing. And this is where, again, scholars would come from all over the Mediterranean, all over the Hellenistic world. The great scholars would come here to study, just like they had gone to Athens and the schools of Athens as well. So here's some other images of what this library may have looked like. These we don't actually know. These aren't actual sort of pictures or paintings of it. This is what people say later that it probably looked like. So again, here's another image of what that Library of Alexandria may have looked like, and another one of scholars taking out the scrolls and reading the scrolls and things like that. So I want to then move on to the next phase. So that's sort of the Hellenistic empires and the Hellenistic period. So let's move to the Roman period, and I'm going to try to do the history of the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire in then like the next 3 minutes. Try to explain that to you. Just sort of really brief, broad overview. So the Roman Empire actually began as a city-state initially, and then as a republic. So I'm going to go back to the very origins of the history of the Roman Empire, but first point out sort of where it was centered. It was centered on the Italian peninsula here, that's sort of in that that square there, sort of right here. Again, just like Greece, juts out into the Mediterranean, is really tied into Mediterranean trade and exchange and influence. And within then the Italian peninsula was this, or in the Italian peninsula was the city of Rome, located at that sort of white square there. Rome was founded as sort of a city state, more or less around 500 BC. Then, for a variety of reasons, it had a great climate, it had great harvests, it was very centrally located on an important river system that tied into the Mediterranean. And because of that, Rome grew very, very wealthy and then started to expand its power. And initially, it was a republic that was whose government was composed basically of mainly of sort of senators and councilors who represented the different parts of Rome in the Roman Republic. But over time, as the republic expanded, it created so many tensions, political tensions, economic tensions, social tensions, that you end up having kind of a civil war in the 100s BCE, and then by the turn of the, I don't know what you call that, by the time you get into the Common Era, or the sort of the era of the AD, by the 100s of the Common Era, then Rome had turned into an empire that was ruled by emperors and was no longer a representative kind of government. It tried to pretend, the first rulers of the Roman Empire tried to pretend it was still a republic, but in actual fact, it was not. But the main point here is not so much if it's a republic or an empire for our purposes. I'm just trying to be kind of historically accurate. What was important is that Rome began to expand relatively early on, and it expanded in kind of four main phases that I'm going to talk about. In the first phase, then between about in the 400s to the 200s BCE, that Rome expands to conquer the Italian peninsula. And here's actually a map of all of the expansion of the Roman Empire. But for this first period, it's really just this sort of purple area right here, where then Rome expands to conquer the Italian peninsula, basically Italy. Then in the second period, it's a period of what's called the Punic Wars. Don't worry too much about this, but this was about sort of remembering what this term is and things like that. The main point here is that it's another phase of the expansion of the Roman Empire, where they went to war against the peoples of Carthage, which was a city here, a really important city in North Africa. And the Carthaginians had expanded their rule across North Africa and into Spain, and then in some of the Mediterranean islands, sort of all the green area here. And the Romans go to war with the Carthaginians in the Punic Wars. And the main point here is that they're able to conquer the Carthaginians and then incorporate all of that area now into this expanding Roman Republic. Um, then the third, oh, actually here, I'll just show you again. So by 220 BCE, then Rome has expanded to include the Italian peninsula as well as much of Spain, and then almost all of North Africa here. So you can see it's getting bigger and bigger, and it's starting to surround the entire Mediterranean. Then now you'll see where what I talked about just a few minutes fits into here. The third phase of the expansion of the Roman Republic is that between 250 BCE, it's able to conquer the Hellenistic empires. And so now you've got this whole area of Greekish learning, art, and architecture now gets incorporated into the Roman Empire. And I'll talk about that more in just a minute. But now it's under basically Roman control. And so in this lecture, then we're looking at the Hellenistic period into the Roman period, when Rome basically conquers and engulfs the Hellenistic empires. So then, and here again is that image of the Hellenistic kingdoms. So Rome now is controlling most of that area. And then there's a fourth phase when Rome expands into Britain and France, from about 50 to about 200 AD, when Rome has now transformed into an empire. And so then you can see uh, Rome, what the areas that Rome controlled at its greatest extent. So by about 200 AD or CE, then Rome controls the entire Mediterranean, basically all of Western Europe, uh, the whole area of Greece and what we call kind of the Near East into Mesopotamia, down into Egypt. So it's taken over, like I said, most of the Hellenistic kingdoms, and it has, again, this very, very wide influence. Um, so hold on before I go into that. So why, again, why are we talking about this? Because when Rome then conquers Greece and the Hellenistic empires, again, just like what happens in the Hellenistic empires, the Romans recognize Greek learning. They adopt Greek art and architecture. If you've ever been to Rome, you'll see that it's full of the Greek architecture, the columns and the pediments. And for our purposes, educated Romans tended to learn Greek, and the Greek literature of the natural philosophers circulates through the Roman Empire, and there's a great respect for and recognition of Greek scholars. The scholars tend to keep writing in Greece and I'm sorry, writing in Greek, and you'll see these Greek scholars, and mainly they tend to be, like I said, in this period, physicians. They tend to center in Alexandria, and then later they tend to center in Rome. Or they might go study in Alexandria for a while, and then, as we'll see in the case of Galen, who we're going to talk about today, they go and they are the physicians to the Roman emperors. So Rome becomes another kind of center of education, but it's largely a Greek education. Uh, so in that sense, you see the continued influence of Greece. I think one scholar had put it this way, that Rome conquered Greece and the Hellenistic world, militarily and politically, but it was Greece that conquered Rome in terms of art and intellectual life. So you see, as I said, the continued great influence of Greek learning. Okay, so moving on then, I want to turn to that kind of history of medicine that I had talked about, and its great importance in this period of time. And in order to do that, we actually have to go back to the classical world. So I hope this isn't too confusing, but to look at the basis of the history of medicine in the Hellenistic world and then the later Roman world that takes over the Hellenistic world, we need to go back to the basis of Greek medicine that was set out in the classical period by a very, very famous doctor, Hippocrates. And you'll see a slide of him in a minute. If you don't know how to spell his name, you'll see it in just a minute. But Hippocrates is sort of thought of as the father of modern medicine. And, as I talked about in the last lecture, we want to be careful of um, looking back to those first originators and creating kind of heroes out of these people. But at the same time, Hippocrates did have a tremendous influence on the medical system that develops in the Western world, from 500 BC basically up through the 1800s. And anyway, so let's turn to the kind of the history of Greek medicine and medical practices. Then we'll talk about Hippocrates. Then we'll look at how Hellenistic physicians um, built upon and in some ways critiqued um, Hippocratic medicine and incorporated Greek natural philosophy. And then we'll look at Roman doctors and again, how Roman physicians and how they also critiqued or incorporated Greek natural philosophy as well, and incorporated Hippocratic ideas. So, just to begin with, in terms of Greek medicine, the Greek god of healing was called Asclepios, and he was considered to be the son of Apollo, and he considered snakes to be sacred, so he's always pictured with a staff with a snake kind of curled around it. And you might be wondering, why are we talking about, healing gods when this is a class about, quote unquote science or natural philosophy? And the whole point is that they're trying to do something that doesn't involve the gods, but actually the Asclepios is sort of important here because there were a number of temples that were dedicated to Asclepios throughout Greece. And these became actually centers for healing, and a healing cult actually developed around the worship of Asclepios. But the temples themselves actually became places where people could come for medical healing, um, related to the god. But as we'll see, this actually, they become kind of early medical schools as well. So actually, Greek medicine does, to a certain extent, come out of the worship of healing gods. But what we'll see with Hippocrates is that he actually then takes the role of gods out of trying to explain the causes of disease and their treatment as well. It's not that he might not believe in these gods, but he doesn't rely on them to understand how it is that disease comes about and how healing takes place. So we'll see that in just a minute. But anyway, so like I said, there were a number of temples that were established to worship Asclepios, and these were referred to as an Asclepion. And like I said, there were several important healing centers that were established throughout Greece. Arguably, one of the most important of them was established on the island of Kos, which is just off the Ionian coast. So here's some images of the Asclepion of Kos. And what would happen at these temples was that sick people would come, they would, come to be healed. And first, they would go through like a purging ritual, which was actually called catharsis, a word that we still have in our modern vocabulary today. They would go through several kind of purifying, purging rituals to kind of purify their body. Then they would actually sleep at the temples, and the idea was that they would have dreams in their sleep, and then their dreams would be interpreted. So these were sort of early methods of healing that went on in these temples. But gradually, they did turn into schools of medicine that, in the case of the Asclepion of Kos, actually trained medical practitioners that had a much more kind of secular outlook. And Hippocrates was one of those. So here's another image of what the Asclepion of Kos probably looked like. Again, it sort of becomes this healing center that kind of morphs into a medical school. And then here's an image of Hippocrates. So Hippocrates was a physician who came from the island of Kos, and it's said that he actually received medical training at the Asclepion of Kos. And let me just show you. Well, here's an image then of Hippocrates and then Democritus. So as you can see, I didn't actually, let me go back to this slide. He lived between about 460 and 370 BCE, which is right at the kind of the right at the height of the classical period of Greece, or actually I should say a little bit prior to it, but he certainly lived during the classical period, and that's why you see him actually then pictured with Democritus, so the atomist that we learned about last week. So here's the island of Kos, sort of this red circle here, that's actually Athens that's circled over there. So again, you can see sort of the distances here. Again, right off the Ionian coast, which we are now very familiar with, lots of major natural philosophers and now physicians coming from this area. We're going to continue to see this in the other kind of famous physicians that we're going to be talking about here. I think virtually all of them came from somewhere in what's modern day Turkey, or right off the coast, in the islands right off of the coast. So that's the island of Kos. So Hippocrates, as I said, comes from Kos, and he studies at the medical school of the Asclepion there. And the school, there's sort of a Hippocratic school that's established there, and I should say in this sense, not a school in the sense of an actual kind of physical school, but a school in the sense of different scholars who uh, sort of discussed and debated things and uh, adhered to the same kind of medical philosophy as Hippocrates. Uh, and I should say, so from this kind of Hippocratic school that develops on the island of Kos, you have a number of treatises that were produced from this period. As many as about 70 different medical texts are produced that are still extant today, that are still in existence today, that we can, read the words that were written back in the 5th and the 4th century BCE. They were written over a period of about 100 years, from about 430 BCE to about 330 BCE. So they couldn't have all been written by Hippocrates himself, even though he is supposedly the author, and it's the collection of texts together is called the Hippocratic Corpus. But as I said, they were written over a period of about 100 years, and so he couldn't have possibly written them all. And it's even debated, it's even questionable whether he wrote any of them. Nobody's ever been able to verify that he himself actually wrote any of the treatises. And the treatises are written sort of in different styles. They're written in the same language, a version of Greek called Ionian or Ionic Greek, but they have different they're written sort of in different styles. There's all sorts of different kinds of treatises, and sometimes they even contradict each other. So it's, Hippocratic scholars agree that Hippocrates is not the author of all of them, or possibly even any of them, but that rather it was the product of a school of a number of different scholars and physicians that were working together, coming out of Kos and then another nearby island. But basically, just think of it as all coming from this the medical school of this island. Um, so I should say that the Hippocratic Corpus then laid out the basis for Western medicine and Western medical thought and Western medical philosophy that, as I said, was built on by later authors, but really provides the seeds and the basis for something that lasts for, more than 2 millennia, actually. So what was that? What was that medical philosophy? What did the corpus teach? What was sort of new and unique about the Hippocratic corpus and the teachings within it? So the treatises included in the Hippocratic corpus uh, covered a whole range of different topics. There were surgical treatises, there were gynecological treatises, there were treatises that included recipes or prescriptions of medicines for various illnesses. There were treatises that included a lot of natural philosophy about the human body and what it was made up of. A whole range of different topics were covered here, but what they did have in common overall is that, like the natural philosophy of the pre-Socratic and the classical Greek philosophers, the Hippocratic um, medicine that was included in this corpus was secular and humanistic, even though it sort of had its origins, or at least Hippocrates may have received an education at this, religious temple. The Hippocratic medicine that is discussed in the treatises of the corpus was secular, in the sense that it didn't refer to gods as, how can I say this, as the divine cause of disease, or as intervening to cause disease, or to cure disease. It's not that Hippocrates doesn't, you'll see this in a few minutes in the Hippocratic Oath, this sort of famous oath of that doctors would take to be ethical in their practice. You'll see them actually sort of praying to various Greek gods of healing and medicine, but they don't um, teach that gods cause disease or that gods can heal disease. And in fact, they take a lot of elements from the earlier, from their contemporaries of natural philosophy. So it's secular and it's also humanistic in the sense that the Hippocratic authors will look for natural laws and try to find, um, you know, general laws to explain how and why disease comes about, to explain human health and what the human body is made of and how it functions. So I should say you also see some anatomy and some physiology, which is the study of the systems of the human body. You'll see some of that in the Hippocratic corpus as well. And so in that sense, it's human centered, and the idea is that humans are capable of understanding these natural laws that govern disease and govern healing and govern the function of the human body. And they're able to deduce what those laws are based on, rationality and logic. So in that sense, again, it probably sounds quite familiar to the Greek natural philosophy we talked about last week, and how, again, the even though they may have, say, prayed to gods and even maybe believed that gods existed, they didn't attribute the intervening of gods to explain natural phenomena. It's the same thing here. They're not going to invoke gods to explain medical phenomena here. So that's a lot of what defines the Hippocratic corpus and makes it different from the kind of healing that was going on elsewhere in Greece, or even at the Asclepion, in which gods would have been invoked to explain the dreams, and there were also sort of religious rituals and sacrifices that were taking place in these temples to try to help people recover as well. So this is something that's different. And a third sort of characteristic of Hippocratic medicine that made it different from other kinds of healing was that it was learned medicine. So it's secular, it's humanistic, looking for natural laws, and it is learned medicine, and that it's written down. The people who are practicing it and writing about it obviously are literate, and it's going to be circulated among other literate practitioners as well. And so this was different from what we could call popular medicine. So in Greece at this time, there was no kind of medical regulation in the sense that, you had to have a medical degree in order to practice medicine. There were all kinds of different kinds of healers. There were sort of herbalists. There were then the kind of the temple healers. And then you have this kind of sect of learned medicine that has developed as well. So this is a kind of a new learned tradition of medicine. And I should say a fourth aspect of Hippocratic medicine that you see in the corpus as well is that it was clinical. There are writings about actual patients. There are medical case histories that are included in the treatises, and they also include information on how to conduct examinations of patients, how to diagnose disease, how to treat disease, medical prognosis. So there's also a very, very practical element to the corpus as well, even though, as I just said a minute ago, there's some strong elements of natural philosophy here, and it's learned medicine. It's also very practical and very much focused on practitioners who are treating patients and giving advice and directions as to how to do that. And again, full of kind of case histories for individuals, what their illness was and how it was treated. So, what was the Hippocratic approach to medicine? Hippocrates, or in the Hippocratic corpus, there is a whole kind of medical system that is laid out, and it's called the humoral system. So I'm going to talk about that, and you'll see how it builds on the natural philosophy of Empedocles and Aristotle, who recognized the four elements. If you think back to last week, and we talked about, there were the atomists, there were the monists, who, like Thales, who says everything comes out of from water, and then there were the pluralists, um, like Empedocles and Aristotle, who said that the world, the stuff in the world, is made up of different combinations of the four different elements: earth, air, fire, and water. Well, for Hippocrates and the Hippocratic school and the Hippocratic corpus, they believed that these four elements combined in different proportions to make up humors in the body. That in the body was basically made up of four different main uh, fluids that were referred to as humors. And so there was yellow bile, black bile, blood, and phlegm. Those were the kind of the four humors that made up the human body. And you can see from this diagram then that yellow bile was associated with heat and fire, blood was associated with air, phlegm was associated with water, and then black bile was associated with earth. And along those lines, too, then yellow bile, just like fire, was considered hot and dry. So they had the primary qualities attached to them as well. So the predominant element in yellow bile was fire. We know fire is hot and dry. That means that yellow bile is hot and dry as well. For blood, which was associated with air, that was hot and wet. And so blood also was considered to be hot and wet as well. And I'll get into you'll see how this relates to disease in just a minute. Along the same lines, then phlegm was always associated with cold, sort of being moist and cold, and then black bile being sort of dry and cold. So the body's made up of these four main humors. I mean, you've got your organs and your organ systems and that kind of thing, but the dominant makeup of the body is you've got these four fluids that are circulating throughout your body. And let me just show you another. Here's another kind of image of the four humors. So blood, black bile, yellow bile, and then phlegm, and then again the four opposing qualities, primary qualities that were associated with each one. So in Hippocratic medicine, if you had if you were healthy, a healthy body had a perfect balance of the four humors. They were in the right proportions, and they were circulating throughout the body, and they're all in balance. So a healthy body had a balance of the four humors. And if you have a balance of the four humors, then all of the qualities of hot, cold, wet, and dry are also in balance in your body. And then by extension, it means that the elemental makeup of your body, of the earth, air, fire, and water that make up the various parts of your body, are also in balance, that your body's in balance. So disease, as you can imagine, comes when those humors are out of balance. So if you start to get too much phlegm in your system, like when you have a cold, think about where that word comes from. Why do we call it a cold? You've got tons of phlegm. I mean, I know you don't need to think about that in too much detail, but your body produces a lot of phlegm, right? So you've got too much phlegm. Your body has an excess of cold, of too much moisture, too much cold, and that's where we get the name cold from. Um, in other illnesses, you might get a fever. Now we recognize fever as a symptom of an illness. In the Hippocratic system, fever actually was a disease in itself. Fever then is an excess of heat. It means you've got too much blood in your system. You've got an imbalance, basically, of in this case then blood. So what might be done for fevers then? Well, now I'm getting into kind of treatment, but what you might do for a fever then, if you've got too much blood, what do? Well, you get rid of some of it, and that's where bloodletting comes from. So they would put, say, leeches on people's skin, the sort of bloodsuckers that would take off blood, or they would insert, sort of cut you in various places in your body, often in the wrists or the inside of the elbow, and then you would bleed. So they would bleed patients and actually take the blood to get rid of the excess blood. But I'll go into the the treatment in just a second, but this is sort of the overall conception of Hippocratic medicine, and you can see how it relates to the theory of the elements of Empedocles that was then adopted by Aristotle, and how it connects what we call the microcosm of the human body to the macrocosm of the entire universe. So you can see how the body is made up of the four elements of earth, air, fire, and water, that the humors that make up the body then reflect the primary qualities of the dominant element within them. And then that connects it to the whole overall conception of what makes up the terrestrial world in contrast to the celestial world with the ether. The human body then is again made up of the main elements of the terrestrial world. So here you see the major basis in natural philosophy that Hippocratic medicine was drawing from. And in addition to that, then you can see this is a systematic system. This becomes a systematic way to explain disease and then to be able to figure out a cure for that disease. It's not, oh, the gods came down and they're angry at us and so they're going to inflict these diseases on us. It's no, for whatever reason now you have an excess of blood in your system, or you have an excess of phlegm. Maybe you aren't eating the right foods, or you're not getting enough sleep. And this is what explains it. And then the therapy becomes, well, let's try to get rid of whatever the overactive or overabundant humor is, and let's try to stop the conditions in which that imbalance took place in the first place, or let's even try to prevent any kind of imbalance from coming. So that's the basic outline of Hippocratic theory. And I just wanted to show you this last slide, and I'm going to show you guys these slides again when we get to Galen, because he's a Roman doctor who lived later. He adopted this Hippocratic ideas and then builds on it. But I wanted to show you this slide because you can see earth, air, fire, and water here. Don't worry about, you're going to see these, I'm calling this the temperaments. So you have a choleric temperament that goes along with an overabundance of yellow bile. That means an overabundance of heat. Don't worry about that right now. That's what Galen adds to this. But what I wanted to show you this slide for is you can also see then the relation to the earth, air, fire, and water too, and the humor that goes along with each of those. So let me move on then. In terms of, so we know, so we can see in Hippocratic medicine what the cause of disease is then. So how do we treat disease? And for Hippocratic medicine, there were three main kinds of treatments. The first and most important was something they called regimen or dietetics. And the idea behind regimen was that you treat disease by your daily regimen, or the way that you live, meaning how much do you sleep? What do you eat? How much exercise do you get? How much time are you outside? What is the environment and the air around you like? And so in Hippocratic medicine, you see all sorts of prescriptions or advice as to how you should live your life so that you can prevent getting any kind of imbalance of humors. And there were the physicians would examine patients and then prescribe specific regimens, specific ways of living. Also, I should say, bathing and cleanliness and things like that were part of the regimen as well. So any kind of like hygiene, how you keep yourself clean, like brushing your teeth, all the things you do to promote good hygiene were also part of the Hippocratic regimen. And it's and then I also have dietetics here too, because dietetics was concerned with what you eat and what times of day you eat. So they might say, oh, eat every 2 hours and eat this kind of food first and then this kind of food. Or they might say, don't eat all day. You need to fast all day. This is the kind of illness that requires fasting. So there were all sorts of prescriptions and advice given as to how you should live your life. And that was basically regimen and dietetics. And for Hippocratic medicine, that was actually the most important kind of therapy you could do and the least invasive. And there's a Hippocratic oath of basically do no harm. And that was how they tried to go about kind of doing no harm was start with the least invasive kind of treatment. And that's what we call today kind of preventative medicine or holistic medicine. That was a major part of the Hippocratic corpus. And in some ways, you could argue that medicine today is trying to go in that direction again, but our medicine today is largely focused on the next two kinds of therapy in Hippocratic medicine, which is something that the Hippocratics actually tried to stay away from as much as possible and only do if you absolutely had to and if regimen didn't work. And those other two sort of therapeutic alternatives were drug therapy and then surgery. So, drug therapy is the thing I think. Well, I should say I think we're quite familiar with both of these. So, drug therapy basically meant the use of medicines that then a sick patient would take in order to try to get better. And medicines in Greek were referred to as pharmaka or pharmaca. It's Pharmaka, and that basically meant medicine. And most medicines in ancient Greek, or I should say in Hippocratic medicine, came from natural sources, from plants, animals, and minerals. For instance, in the Hippocratic corpus, you have about 1,500, as I should say, as many as 1,500 recipes or prescriptions that named a variety of medicines to take for various ailments. And they mainly were made up of herbs or sort of plant medicines from plant sources. They included things like cinnamon, ginger, sage, oregano, mint, literally hundreds of different plant substances. As many as 250 different plant substances were used in Hippocratic medicine. They also included a few medicines that derived from mineral and animal products as well. Sometimes animal blood was prescribed or animal bile. Animal hooves were ground up and burned in order to be taken as medicines. And then you also had some mineral medicines like cinnabar was a mineral ore that was taken medicinally, or different arsenic compounds. And I should say some mercury compounds, of which cinnabar is one. And actually, I should just say right here that this is actually what I've done a lot of research on in terms of what they call the materia medica of um, in Western medicine, which means the different substances that made up medicines, the medical materials of this tradition. This is what a lot of my research is on. Um, so why these substances? Basically, in Hippocratic medicine, these medicinal substances were considered to have healing powers within them that came from nature. And the substances themselves, just like everything on Earth, were made up of some combination of earth, air, fire, and water. And because of that, they had certain qualities associated with those elements. So these medicinal substances just like everything else on Earth, everything in the terrestrial world, we're made up of some combination of earth, air, fire, and water. And so, along those lines, then they would have a predominance of being either hot or moist or cold or dry. And so, what a physician would do is that he would examine a patient, determine what was the disease, an overabundance of black bile, yellow bile, um, blood, or phlegm, and then based on that, so is it an overabundance of heat, of moisture, of coldness, or of dryness, and then pick some kind of medicinal herb or kind of animal blood or some kind of mineral ore that has that quality, that I should say, that has the opposing quality, and then have the patient take that medicine. So lettuce, for instance, was considered to be have a medicinal power, a medicinal quality of being cold. And so if you had a fever, you could do bloodletting, or you could have the patient take lettuce, or I'm sorry, eat lettuce. And lettuce again would be considered medicinal. It was cold, it would counteract the heat of the fever. And so this is how Hippocratic medicines were thought to work. And as you can see from my example, there actually was quite a large overlap between substances that were considered to be medicines and what we consider today to be foods. So foods, again, also being made up of one of, some combination of the four elements, were considered to have, you know, qualities as well. You could classify them as hot, cold, wet, or dry. Then again, you would take the opposite of the food or the medicine, and then you would take a food or medicine of the opposite quality to the quality of the illness, and that way you would be able to establish balance within the body once again. Then a third area of Hippocratic medicine was surgery, and that was considered to be the most invasive. That included cauterizing wounds as well as lots of different kinds of surgeries that were practiced. But like I said, that was considered the last resort and only done if regimen doesn't work and if drug therapy doesn't work. And I should say one last thing about food. So a lot of foods were considered to be medicines as well, but then you can see why in regimen what you eat had a lot to do with the kind of balance of the humors then that would be brought about in your body. So if you tended again toward being kind of hot, then you might want to try to eat foods that were considered to be cooling on a regular basis in order to maintain balance within your system. So that summarizes kind of the main Hippocratic theories of disease and disease treatment. And again, you can see there is no intervention of gods in the diagnosis or the treatment of illness here. It has been established as a system of basically natural laws of balance and imbalance, and the way you treat the imbalance is based upon, again, the natural laws concerning what matter is made of, the elemental makeup of matter, and then the primary qualities associated with matter. So you can see, again, there isn't reference to gods for these explanations, and this system had great influence throughout the Mediterranean in the classical period, and then moving into the Hellenistic periods, and in particular, as I talked about a little while ago, Alexandria becomes a center for medical learning and medical treatment in the Hellenistic world, and you can see then a number of scholars who then converge on Alexandria and who both build upon and challenge the Hippocratic system. And then we'll turn to the Roman world and then see what happens with Hippocratic medicine there as well. So to conclude the discussion of Hippocrates and Hippocratic medicine, then just want to show you the sort of a famous Hippocratic oath that that doctors actually take, that doctors took under at the time of Hippocrates, and even today it's sort of well known among modern doctors, where you take an oath to practice ethically. What I want to show you is just a few elements from this. First of all, in the very first line, you can see it says, "I swear by Apollo, the healer, Asclepius, Hygeia, and Panacea," who were other sort of Greek gods and goddesses of healing. So you can see that they're still there, but again, not attributed with any cause of disease. And then below here it says, "I will prescribe regimens for the good of my patients according to my ability and my judgment, and never do harm to anyone." So the whole premise with Hippocratic medicine was to do no harm. And again, you can see the emphasis here on regimen and hygiene and dietetics. And then the next line says, "I will give no deadly medicine to anyone if asked, nor suggest any such counsel. And similarly, I will not give a woman a pessary," which was sort of like a vaginal suppository, to cause an abortion. So you can again see this sort of promise to not use certain kinds of medicines. And also, I should say that while some medicines were sort of overlapped with foods, poisons were also considered to be pharmaca. And so here again, you see the physician promising not to use poisonous medicines for patients. So those are some elements of the Hippocratic Oath that can again reflect what we've just talked about in terms of Hippocratic medicine. And then here's a sort of a medieval version of the Hippocratic Oath, set into the form of a cross, which shows the Christian influence that we're going to be talking about in the next a few weeks from now. And then here's another sort of early manuscript showing recipes in the Hippocratic corpus, so you can see what they would have looked like in some of their early iterations. Uh, so now I want to turn. So that sort of concludes the Hippocratic section of the lecture. Now I want to turn to Alexandrian medicine and the medicine that takes place, or I should say that develops during the Hellenistic age that we had talked about at the beginning of lecture. So now we're passing from the classical to the Hellenistic period. And during this time, a number of sort of medical authorities gain fame, but it's that situation I talked about at the beginning of the lecture where we actually don't have any of the works from this period that are extant, that we only know of them through later writings actually. So everything I'm going to be talking about we only know of because these physicians and these scholars were talked about by later peoples, but we do know a fair amount about them. So what you see in the Hellenistic period then is a number of physicians, and we're going to talk about three, who all come from that Asia Minor, that area of what is modern day Turkey or the islands around it. And they generally are trained in that area. Some of them go to Athens, and then they end up in Alexandria, that we talked about earlier, this really important city with the museum. And there you see a medical school that's established, an Alexandrian medical school that in many ways actually kind of rejects the Hippocratic system, and especially Hippocratic natural philosophy. And they really concentrate on anatomy, which you don't see a whole lot of in the Hippocratic corpus. So I'm going to go through three practitioners, or I should say three physicians and scholars, or we could even call them kind of physician philosophers from the Hellenistic period. The first of whom we'll talk about is Herophilus of Chalcedon. So Chalcedon again was in Asia Minor or in Anatolia, and then he studies medicine there, and then he goes to Alexandria. But I should say, if you look at his dates, he's right at the tail end of the kind of the Hippocratic corpus when those were produced. So he's of this kind of earlier period. I'm sorry, later period. He's from the Hellenistic period, and then he ends up migrating to Alexandria, and there With the next person we're going to talk about, Erasistratus, the two of them establish a medical school in Alexandria. So Erasistratus was from one of the islands off of the Ionian coast. He lived from around 304 to 250 BC, so contemporaneous with Herophilus, but again, sort of later than the Hippocratic school. And the two of them are especially famous for, as you can see from this this image, for being anatomists, for carrying out dissections, and in particular human dissections. And it's even said that they carried out vivisections of prisoners in Alexandria. Vivisection meaning basically carrying out a dissection on somebody or something that's still living. So you can just imagine what that would be like to be dissected while you're still alive. I it's sort of a bit gory to think about, but the advantage of that is that then you can see the systems actually still working, and the blood flowing and the heart pumping and the digestive system working while you're, you know, looking at it. Anyway, imagine they didn't live too long when they're being dissected, but anyway. Okay, so these are some images of Erasistratus, who was also famous for carrying out dissections. And then here's an image of the two of them. And I'm going to kind of talk about them together in terms of what their accomplishments were. So like I said, the two of them were known for very careful studies of anatomy that they did as a result of the dissections and the vivisections that they carried out. They were able to identify the nervous system, the brain, and then its connection to the spinal cord and to the nerves, and to differentiate between motor nerves and sensory nerve. They also identified the organs of the abdominal cavity, including the liver, the pancreas, the intestines, reproductive organs, and the heart. They also were able to differentiate blood vessels between arteries and veins, and they proposed a theory of sort of digestion and circulation to explain kind of human physiology, the working of the systems. And in doing so, they actually rejected the Hippocratic system in favor of a natural philosophy and a theory of matter that stemmed from the Stoics, with the idea of the pneuma, as well as Democritus and the idea of atoms or particles. So, what their theory of the working of the human body was that you have veins, arteries, and nerves all throughout your body, and that then when you eat food, it goes to the stomach. In the stomach, it's turned into like a juice. Then that juice is absorbed by the intestines and goes to the liver, where it is turned into blood. Then the blood enters your veins and then brings sort of nourishment, nutrition, sustenance to the body that way through the veins. But according to Herophilus and Erasistratus, the arteries actually did not carry blood. They did not contain blood. Instead, they contained the pneuma, if you remember that from the Stoic philosophy, that sort of life-giving spirit. So the pneuma flows through the arteries to all parts of the body and basically brings kind of a life force to the body, and then also enters in the nerves and allows for movement and sensation. And the pneuma comes from actually respiration from the lungs. And so the idea was that you draw in breath, you draw in pneuma through your breath, then through the lungs, and then into the heart. The pneuma travels, and then from the heart to the arteries, and the pneuma goes into the arteries, and then through your arteries, the pneuma is spread throughout the rest of the body. And in this way, like I said a few minutes ago, it's really this medical philosophy embraces the atomism of Democritus, and sees the body and in that sense, the terrestrial world as composed of particles. Everything in the body is particles that are interacting. So not made up of, earth, air, fire, and water. And in addition to that, you see then the Stoic influence with the pneuma that's then flowing throughout the body. So that's really kind of the contribution of these two physicians in terms of their anatomy, the physiology that they propose, and then also, as you can see, they're really kind of undermining or going against the natural philosophy that undergirded the Hippocratic medicine of the four elements with the four humors. So this is not humoral medicine. This is actually they were sort of opposed to this and then presenting kind of an alternative to Hippocratic medicine. And also these ideas led them to propose a theory for the causation of disease, which was that they argued that overeating actually caused an overabundance of blood to flow throughout the system. And when that happened, then you would find blood entering the arteries where it wasn't supposed to be. There was only supposed to be pneuma in the arteries. And that when the blood flowed into the arteries, then that led to things like inflammation and imbalances and pain and fever in the body and in the extremities as well. And so that explained, this whole system then and how it functioned was able to explain the cause of disease and many of the symptoms that you would see with inflammation and pain and fever associated with disease. So you can see that then this is a very different system than that set up by Hippocrates. And the same was true of another physician, Asclepiades of Bithynia. So another tongue twister name. He lived in from the 120s to about 40 BC, so the second and first centuries BCE, so a little bit later than these two. He actually, so he's from Bithynia here in again in Asia Minor, Anatolia, and he actually settles in Rome, so not Alexandria at this stage, as Rome is becoming sort of as the Roman expansion is taking place, and Rome is becoming more and more of an important intellectual center. But Asclepiades also had an atomistic theory for how the body worked. He taught that disease was caused by problems. Well, let me back up. He believed that the body again was composed of particles and that disease came when the particles couldn't flow freely through the body, and so they either they blocked pores, and from that basically disrupted normal circulation and balance, and that this is what caused disease. And he actually recommended eating certain kinds of foods that would uh, produce very small particles within the body, and also drinking a lot of wine. So in that sense, his therapy was, I think, was pretty popular among the Romans. At any rate, the main point here is that you've got these three physicians who are proposing alternatives to the Hippocratic humoral system during this Hellenistic period, and also proposing new kinds of, I should say, making new proposals for physiological systems, and especially with Herophilus and Erasistratus carrying out these dissections and getting a, a much better understanding of human anatomy and how the systems within the human body worked. So with these kind of medical thinkers and the proposal of these different kinds of alternatives, as you can imagine, the Alexandrian kind of world of medicine, or the Hellenistic world of medicine, is full of all these different kinds of competing theories and competing ideas about what causes disease, how to treat disease. And so what actually happens is in Alexandria and really throughout the Mediterranean world, you see three different schools of medicine come into being, and they were uh, opposed to each other, and there was really no kind of medical consensus during this period. And those schools were called the Methodist school, the dogmatist, or another word is the rationalist school, and the empiricist school. So the Methodist school was a school that taught that you needed to follow as you can imagine, a particular method in medicine, and what they would sort of evaluate the body and the cause of disease based on actually how tense or how relaxed your muscles were, and then from that you would follow a particular method of treatment, and that's where they got their name. The dogmatists or the rationalists were those like Erasistratus, Herophilus, and Asclepiades, who, even though they may not have agreed on 100% of all of their theories, just the fact that they have theories of the body and how the body works and cause of disease and then treatment of disease based upon those theories of how the body works, the fact that they follow this theory and they base their treatment on theory is what qualified them as dogmatists, or again rationalists. That's kind of a nicer name, the rationalists, that they have a rational set of ideas and theories as to how they treat disease and how they determine the cause of disease. And then third, you have the empiricists, who said the Methodists and the dogmatist rationalists have it all wrong. You really shouldn't come to medicine with any kind of preconceived theory. Rather, you should just look at symptoms and then treat the symptoms on a case by case basis. And again, not try to draw out any theories or any natural laws from this. Just take it on an experiential level and just treat it again on an individual case by case basis. And don't worry about if it's particles or pores, or is it elements, or is it primary qualities, or is it humors. Like, we don't care. We just want to try to get the patient better, and if I can give them this herb and they feel better, that's what I'm going to do. If I'm give them this medicine, this medicinal herb, and they feel better, great. If they do a take a bath or do a purification or some sort of take a something that will help them to purge, and that makes them feel better, that's what I'm going to do. But I'm not going to follow a particular kind of theory. So that's what the empiricists sort of adhered to. So as you can imagine, with all these different kinds of theories and practices kind of circulating throughout the Mediterranean Hellenistic world, there was really no consensus during this period as to what the best medicine was to follow, if it was better to follow a medical system or not, and if you were going to follow a system or a theory, which one would that be? There really was no consensus whatsoever. So this was the state of Hellenistic medicine coming into the first century CE under the Roman Empire. And at this time, two major figures emerged who rejected these teachings, rejected the different schools of medicine of the Hellenistic period. One of whom rejected all medical theory, and the other one actually proposes a very complete medical system based upon the Hippocratic teachings, but extending them further. And these two individuals were Dioscorides and Galen. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Dioscorides of Anazarbus, who lived in the first century in the Roman Empire. He too came from Asia Minor, Anatolia, from this. Let me just get my pen again. It keeps disappearing. Anyway, from this area right here, he was trained as a physician, and he actually was part of the Roman Empire. And in doing so, he actually traveled all throughout the Roman Empire. And in doing so, he studied the medicinal plants mainly, but also the mineral and animal materials that I had talked about with the Hippocratic corpus. But he went about the Roman Empire trying to identify medicinal plants that he had heard about and that he knew had medicinal qualities and actually even test them out to make sure that they worked. And then he wrote them down in basically what was a medical, a materia medica encyclopedia of all the known medicinal substances in the Roman world at the time. And then he described their botanical characteristics and then what they cured. And that treatise that he wrote down was called De Materia Medica. And in it, he discussed over 1,000 different kinds of uh, medicinal substances. And his work was considered to be very carefully done and very trustworthy because he himself had gone about identifying these plants and then testing them out himself. And this work, it's difficult to overemphasize the profound impact that this work has had on Western medicine and Western pharmacy since it was written in the first century CE, in the sense that it really formed the basis for the Western pharmacological tradition, to the point where I actually did a study of this, comparing De Materia Medica with um, pharmaceutical treatises from the first century through the 19th century, and then comparing how many of those pharmaceutical works mentioned the medicinal substances in Dioscorides' work. And as late as the 1850s, 60% of the materia medica in sort of official pharmacopoeias were also named in Dioscorides. So he really sets out the basis of the pharmacological tradition from the time that this book is published. I mean, not published, but written. And it's, as we'll see, it's translated into many different languages. It is well known from, you know, North Africa up to Scandinavia, through the medieval and early modern period. It has just a tremendous impact on Western medicine and the Western pharmaceutical tradition. It's really, there's no other work that had so much impact on providing the basis for the kinds of substances that were used as medicines from then on. And it really broadens out the number of substances that you see in the Hippocratic corpus. There are about 250 medicines named in the Hippocratic corpus, and over 1,000 in Dioscorides, and then that again, that sets out the basis for the later tradition. So I just want to then now go into the second of these two figures that I wanted to emphasize from the Roman period. And this person that I want to talk about then is Galen of Pergamon. So, and he lived in then the second century CE of the Roman Empire, so a little bit later than Dioscorides. And I should say he used De Materia Medica as the basis for his work on medicinal substances as well. But so who is Galen? Galen was a physician from the city of Pergamon, again from Asia Minor. So you again can see the absolute that this is that modern day Turkey was really the core center for so many of these medical scholars from the Hellenistic and the Roman period. And I should say, Pergamon was an important medical center in Asia Minor. He trained there, and then he actually goes to Alexandria for medical training as well. And eventually he ends up in Rome, and he becomes so famous and so well recognized as a doctor that he becomes the physician to a series of Roman emperors in Rome as well. So I want to talk about Galen himself, and then his medical system, his anatomy, his physiology, and then the ways in which he built upon earlier natural philosophers, and then the medical system and natural philosophy of Hippocrates. So to begin, as I said, he was from Pergamon, studied in Alexandria, then ends up in Rome. But what is perhaps best the reason we know Galen best is because he produced a voluminous amount of writing. But I just want to show you this slide really quick, just shows you another version of Pergamon. So that's sort of the region of Pergamon and then the city of Pergamon. And I should say that Pergamon is the Greek version of the name, and then Pergamum was what it was called in the Latin version under the Roman Empire. And then here's an image of Hippocrates and Galen because, as you'll see in a few minutes, Galen really built upon the Hippocratic system. He totally rejects the atomism of the Hellenistic physicians that we just talked about, and then embraces the four element theory, and then embraces the four humors and the whole humoral system of Hippocrates, and then adds to it. So, as I said a minute ago, he wrote a ton. It's the best way to put it. And all of his works, like the Hippocratic Corpus, his works are extant. They are available to us, and they have come down to us from posterity. In the 19th century, they were translated into Latin. The full corpus was translated into Latin because Galen, like Dioscorides and like these other physicians we've talked about, they all wrote in Greek. Even though they lived in the Roman Empire, they wrote in Greek and not Latin. Their works were translated into Latin in later periods, but there's a full corpus that was translated, sort of the official translation in the 19th century. It takes up 22 volumes, so thousands of pages. In fact, Galen's corpus makes up, I've read 10% of all of the writings we have from the Roman Empire. So you can just imagine how much that is. So a really voluminous writer, and he wrote about a wide variety of topics. Similar to the Hippocratic Corpus, you see this, a whole wide variety that extend from natural philosophy into medical, clinical medicine and diagnosis. And he wrote about pharmacy, pharmacology. Those texts I have studied and read extensively. He wrote about anatomy. He wrote about the symptoms and the causes of disease, methods of healing, physiology. He also wrote out, clinical case studies of his, personal experiences with healing. And in terms of his method, he proposed sort of a middle line between, say, the empiricists and the rationalist dogmatists. What he proposed was what scholars have called a doctrine of qualified experience. He said, yes, on the one hand, there is medical theory that should guide your thought, but you should always look at the individual patient and the individual case and choose the kind of treatment and the kind of medicines that are going to be best for that patient, regardless of whether the theory tells you you should or not. So he proposed sort of a middle ground between those debates, but overall he had no love for any of the Alexandrian schools, for any of those medical sects that we talked about, and he vigorously opposed the atomism of Erasistratus and Asclepiades of Bithynia, which you can see in his writings. He's constantly attacking them. He wrote voluminously, and in doing so, he often attacked people that he disagreed with. And in doing so, he built up his a system of humoral medicine that lasted, like Dioscorides setting up the basis for pharmacology. Galen set up the basis for Western medicine that again lasted through the 19th century. So, what was that system? I'm going to talk about first Galen's anatomy and his physiology, and then turn to his natural philosophy and the way that he built upon Hippocrates. So Galen, let me stay here. So Galen, like Herophilus and Erasistratus, he was a great anatomist. He also performed dissections and vivisections, but in this case, not of human beings, but mainly animals. There was sort of a moratorium on human dissection under the Roman Empire, and so he then turned to the dissection of animals. And it's said, it's sort of disturbing to think about this too, but that he would perform vivisections on pigs, and then to show the vocal cords and the larynx, he would us that that apparently like the pigs would be like screaming in pain, and then he would cut off the voice, the larynx, so that then the scream would stop. Then he would open it so that you could hear this pig scream again, and then shut it, or close it, so that the people in the audience watching the dissection could see exactly what it was that the larynx does, that the voice box does. So he performed, like I said, he performed a number of dissections and was able to describe the skeletal system, the bones and the muscles, also the brain and the nervous system, the eyes. He also identified veins and arteries like his predecessors, as well as the heart, and was in this way was able to give sort of a systematic account of human anatomy. He was also able to explain the body systems in some ways that do parallel the teachings of Erasistratus. He also described digestion as basically you eat food, it goes to the stomach, there it's turned into juice. Then the juice filters through the stomach and the intestines into the liver, where again it turned into blood and then was circulated throughout the body to nourish it. But unlike Erasistratus, he saw the veins and the arteries both carrying blood. He saw the liver then as the source for blood and the source of how blood gets to the blood vessels then that nourish the body. Then the blood would be carried to the heart and the lungs, and it would enter the right side of the heart and then diffuse to the left side of the heart. So he did not understand the pulmonary circulation, that basically the right side of the heart pumps blood to the lungs, and then the lungs come down to the left side of the heart, which is how we understand it today. He actually believed that it entered the right side and then, like I said, diffused through the wall of the heart to the left side, and then again out to the arteries and the veins. And he also taught that then they were filled with a kind of spirit or pneuma that then infused the nerves, the nervous system, and allowed for sensation and movement. So, in that way, similar to Erasistratus, but he added another component, which was he taught that the body had sort of this innate heat, this kind of vital spirit of an innate heat that worked in digestion to basically cook the food, and that also worked in the heart as well to infuse the blood with the pneuma that comes from the breath. So he adds this layer of the innate heat to his anatomy and his physiology. But where he really differed from Erasistratus, like I said a few minutes ago, was that was in his natural philosophy and in the Hippocratic basis for Galen's medicine, um, because he fully embraced Hippocratic medicine and Hippocratic theory. And scholars argue that he actually served to clarify and popularize Hippocratic medicine to the extent that the way we understand Hippocratic medicine today really comes from and through Galen, that he really took the Hippocratic corpus and the ideas in it and then turned it into the system that we understand it as today. So in that sense, there's a huge influence of Hippocrates on Galen, but also, like I said, Galen is hugely important for understanding Hippocrates, even though they were separated from a period of basically 500 years. There's a huge amount of continuity between Hippocrates and then Galen. And again, it's Galen's system that ends up kind of winning out over all of the others. And whereas there was no consensus coming into the Roman period that we're talking about, following Galen's death, within a century after he died, the Galenic system spreads throughout the Mediterranean and is embraced and accepted um, throughout the entire what had been sort of the Hellenistic and the Roman world, and then continues on again for the next basically millennium or more, actually kind of millennium and a half or more. Um, so where we see the influence then of Hippocrates is through Galen's teachings that the body is composed of four humors: the yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, and blood, that these humors then have qualities attached to them, and that the way you diagnose disease is by determining if the disease is um, a result of too much heat, too much moisture, too much dryness, or too much coldness, and then applying a regimen or prescribing a regimen that will help to counterbalance that or to again preserve the balance, or then prescribing medicines that then have the opposite quality. And they call this contrary cures or contrary curing, because you prescribe a medicine that is the opposite quality to the disease. So this was his idea of therapeutics, and you can see the clear Hippocratic basis of it. But he also added a few other elements to it. In the first place, Galen taught that you could um, measure the amount of imbalance there was in a particular quality. So he would classify diseases as is it hot in the first degree, which is only a little teeny bit of heat? Is it in the second degree, which is much stronger? Is it in the third degree or the fourth degree? So he actually proposed a system of degrees up to 4 degrees, with the fourth being the strongest, as a way to measure just how significant and severe the disease imbalance was. And the same with medicines. So the different medicinal herbs, he would classify them according to degrees. So, for instance, mint might be considered hot in the second degree and dry in the first degree, or a really I'm trying to think, like a pepper would be, say, hot in the fourth degree, because it was often based upon the actual the taste or the sort of characteristics of the medicine that would determine if people thought it was hot, cold, wet, or dry. And for instance, pepper was considered hot because it's sort of that hot, spicy hot. So he added it. Anyway, he added this system of degrees. He also added in a system in which different characteristics were associated with the kind of imbalance that you had of the particular humor. And humors then were associated with different kinds of characteristics within a person's like personality. And the whole combination of the person or the medicine of its the kinds of elements and humors and qualities that made up a person, or the kinds of elements and qualities that made up a medicine, and then the degrees of those qualities were considered the person's or the medicine's complexion. It was referred to as a complexion or a temperament. And they basically meant the same thing. So if mint was hot, and I can't remember what I said, but like hot in the second degree and dry in the first degree, that was its complexion. Whereas a human being might have, if you had an excess of blood, you were said to be have a sanguine personality, or if you had an excess of black bile, you were considered to have a melancholy personality. And it might be, you might be uh, and you're say you have too much black bile, and it's to the third degree, that's going to be considered your complexion. So whatever your humoral makeup is, and the degrees to which those humors show themselves in your body, that's considered to be your complexion or your temperament. And you can see in the modern use of the word temperament, that refers to people's kind of character and personality. And that was often that was extended to people through the Galenic system. So let me just show you then. I just wanted to remind you of these that we saw with Hippocratic medicine. And now move on then to the four temperaments that went along with this. So a sanguine temperament, as I said a minute ago, meant that you had too much blood and that your system was hot and moist. If you had a choleric temperament, that meant that you had too much yellow bile, and that meant that you had a temperament that was sort of hot and dry, and you have too much yellow bile. Or if you had a melancholy temperament, that meant you had too much black bile and you were cold and dry. And then again, phlegmatic meant you were moist and cold. And so what you would do is if you had, say, a phlegmatic temperament, then you would try to eat foods that were hot and dry, and you would try to take medicines that were hot and dry. If the regimen didn't help to correct your imbalance, then you would have to go and take medicines. And say that you were moist in the third degree and cold in the second degree, then you would try to take medicines that were dry in the third degree and then hot in the second degree to exactly match whatever your imbalance was. You would try to get medicines of that same degree. And again, these were then the things that Galen added to the Hippocratic base. So, and then here again is this this, what do you call it? Overview of the temperaments with earth, air, fire, and water. Those elements and then their relationship to the temperament. So earth is associated with a melancholic temperament. It's cold and dry, and it means that you have an excess of black bile in your system. And then they actually even associated it with different seasons too, in later sort of iterations of this system. If you have the element fire, that leads to a choleric temperament. It's hot and dry, and it comes from too much yellow bile. So yellow bile is going to be composed chiefly of the element fire. And again, that's related to youth and summer, and again in later iterations. And then so on and so forth with air and water. And then you can see even the overlaps between that as well. So that um, so that then brings us to our discussion of the Galenic, uh, the Hippocratic basis of Galenic medicine. But I just want to point out too that here we also see the influence of Aristotle and the pluralism and of the four element theory, the earth, air, fire, water, the hylomorphism of form and matter, in the sense that the matter is inherently intertwined with the primary qualities associated with it. And we see a system being built out of that, a very complex system uh, being built out of those ideas. You also see then the relationship between the microcosm of the human body and the humoral system, and then that macrocosm of the Aristotelian cosmology, where you've got the terrestrial world, the terrestrial elements, all the combining and the changing of these different elements into different kinds of matter. And again, the matter being combined into the humors, and then determining which element, and along those lines, which qualities are dominant in which humor within the body. And you can also see the influence of Plato in this system, in that Galen also believed, like Plato, in a teleological universe, in the sense that he believed that all things on earth were um, formed in the best possible way to create uh, basically the best of all possible worlds, that there was a sense of intelligent design. And he even specifically talks about the demiurge and the fact that the demiurge has created three different faculties or sort of powers within the human body. He named a nutritive faculty, a generative faculty, and a natural faculty, which he believed also directed the workings of the human body. And these faculties were basically the way that the demiurge functioned in order to make the body work in the best possible way. He actually wrote a treatise on called The Usefulness of the Parts of the Body, in which he argued that each part of the body was designed to function to support the whole and to work with the other parts of the body so that it all worked together kind of in perfect harmony. And then again, tying the microcosm to the macrocosm, that's how he saw the world work as well. And he actually talked about nature infused with the demiurge, or nature as the demiurge, as this power that designed nature in this with this intelligent design so that it would all work together harmoniously. He refers to nature as an equitable artist who brings together the world in this sort of perfect way. So in this way, again, you can see Aristotelian elements, you can see Platonic elements, you can see Hippocratic elements, and you can also see the Stoic elements in that he believed that there was a pneuma, again, that was sort of ingested within the body and that infused the nerves as well. So Galen, in many ways, really brings together a lot of the earlier natural philosophy that we looked at and puts together this incredibly complex system that, again, underscored Western medicine for the next, 1500 years. And we will see how the works of Galen and Dioscorides and others are then translated into Arabic in the Islamic world, especially when Arab invaders, I should say, Islamic invaders come in and conquer Alexandria in the 7th century, and then they get all of these medical works and they translate them into Arabic, and then they're later then translated into Latin in medieval Europe. So you can see that these thinkers and their natural these medical thinkers and their natural philosophies have a huge and long-lasting impact on the Western scientific tradition.